Hello, everybody. So
What is that?
this is going to be a little different than the take that you've heard from the other speakers because I'm going to be talking about people more than data per se, and talking about researchers in particular, researchers who produce the data that we're now starting to increasingly mandate the sharing of for a lot of good reasons, as you've heard. So I'll be talking about research data and particularly data produced by researchers across disciplines with federal and other kinds of public funding. And I'm talking about this because at UC Davis there's a project that I'm involved in called Innovating Communication in Scholarship, and one of the themes of it is communicating with data or data as a new form of scholarship. And last December we had a workshop called Data Rights and Data Wrongs, which discussed a lot of the same themes that we're talking about today, including ownership and control. So what I'm going to try to do is summarize that day in 10 minutes or so. And so it'll be a little disjoint, but hopefully there's some key ideas and themes in here that we can continue to talk about today because it was a very interesting discussion, which, well, I hope you agree. So we started off by talking to Christine Boardman, the UCLA researcher at the iSchool there, who has a brand new book called Big Data, Little Data, No Data, Scholarship in the Networked World, coming out of MIT Press. And Chris is a fantastic writer, and she's a very, very thorough researcher. So if you're interested in this topic, I highly recommend that you get your hands on that book. And she explained that sharing research, including the data and software that supports it, is almost always motivated by scholarly credit. Importantly, when it comes to research data sharing, mandates and policies don't work without real buy-in from the researchers who produce the data, because it's very easy to share data in ways that guarantee it will be completely useless, right? And I think we all know that's true. But today, data just is not part of the scholarly credit system. It doesn't count towards promotion and tenure. Journals have a very sophisticated mechanism that's evolved over a long time for providing credit to researchers, legitimatizing, disseminating, preserving, making it discoverable, all that great stuff. We don't have any of that for data or software. We don't know who gets to be first author or last author or anything like that. So none of that exists, and we also think that, or she was positing, that shoehorning data into the journal model is not necessarily going to work very well because it's fundamentally different. Concepts like authorship have not been worked out, may not apply in the case of data, so we shouldn't just assume that that's the right model to apply to these newer forms of scholarship. She also pointed out repeatedly that useful data are not facts, and that was responding to the meme that data is factual, therefore it doesn't fall under any of the legal rights regimes like copyright. So she says, not true. You need to know the context for the data. You need to have metadata to be able to use it or interpret it. You need to know what it's actually describing. It doesn't stand alone. Even opening a file is difficult if you don't have the right software, and you have to know what that software is. So we tend to talk about data as if it's this entity like a book or a journal article, but it's a very different creature. She pointed out that data ownership is extremely unclear, or rarely clear, so that sharing it doesn't happen a lot of times because nobody knows who can make the decision about when and how to share it. It's just researchers have no idea who's authorized or responsible for making those decisions. So throughout the meeting, we heard from a lot of different people about different perspectives on data sharing. Researchers, funders, publishers, universities, and the public, and where those views align and where they differ. So there are a lot of agents in the mix, right? Many researchers lay claim to their data. They just believe that it's theirs to make all decisions about. But that's starting to change. Journals are also important because they've started to establish data sharing rules or practices or policies. And funders now, as we've just heard, are increasingly imposing data sharing requirements on researchers to get back that benefit of the investment that they've made in the research. Institutions also play an important role. So we heard from all of those stakeholders. And one kind of interesting question came up around the researcher's rights and responsibilities, right? Publications are an argument made by an author that is supported by data, okay? And if a researcher uses the data, they're signing off on its veracity for use in their own research for their new argument. So for researchers, there's a real ethical commitment here. Whatever the law or policy may require, what we should really focus on is what matters for research, what is the right thing to do, rather than what we're asking people to do for various economic reasons. So one of the more interesting and underrepresented perspectives of the day came from the UC Office of the President, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with and Tom works for. The Office of General Counsel was present to talk about their position on research data ownership. And kind of, well, it was an interesting discussion because the University of California posits that it actually has a contractual obligation to maintain the ownership of all research data produced from grant-funded projects by any researcher at UC, especially federally funded grants. So they claim that the university owns the data. And since the university is the recipient of the funds and the official grantee, it's the legal entity that has to agree to the grant's terms and conditions and the data management plan that the PI writes. So the university is legally obligated to retain the original records of the research. Okay? So she points out that there are a lot of shared interests in data. There's the PI, co-PIs, students, postdocs, the institution, and so on, and these often come into conflict with each other. So it's important that there be some entity that can adjudicate in those cases and keep everybody's interests in mind. And the other issue has to do with the funders and publishers, right? If an author is agreeing to some terms and conditions from a publisher to share their data, then the institution has the legal responsibility to ensure that they've done that. So it's widely recognized, I think, by the Office of the President and everybody else that the PI, the researcher, is the primary steward of the data, but doesn't necessarily have exclusive control over the data. So the PI is the one who makes the data accessible to the university and allows the university to audit or sequester it as needed, say, for example, in cases of fraud, complaints of fraud. So stewardship is really the question that we should be focusing on. It's that day-to-day control over the access, not ownership. And in other words, stewardship is a practical issue, not a legal one. Okay? So this is kind of off the wall, but one really interesting anecdote that came up was from Tony Tyson, who's the PI astronomer on the Large Synoptic Sky Telescope project. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, but in their case, the data is the primary product of the project, and it's a collaboration of over 40 institutions all over the world who have jointly created this massive relational database. It's probably the biggest database in all of academic research right now. I won't bore you with the numbers, but it's really vast. And no single researcher, university, or government can claim ownership of it. In fact, they decided that, well, the universe can't be owned. So they sidestepped the whole issue and created a 501c3 that is now protecting the database and all the other findings of the project outside the context of any institution or any funder. I don't know how well that will hold up legally, but it raises this issue of large-scale international collaborations, which we're increasingly involved in, and how we can even have these conversations when there is no legal interoperability globally. So we also spent a lot of time talking about legal tools, which seems incredibly boring at some level, but this is what we actually do day in and day out with this data. And we heard that what researchers really care about is reassurance that their work is being protected and that they can stay in control of the data to some degree. So a common approach has been to use these data usage agreements. We heard about that a little bit earlier this morning, and those are essentially contracts between the data provider or the data owner and data consumers. There are no standards for data usage agreements, so they tend to be different from institution to institution and even for every single data set, which means that researchers don't understand them, typically ignore them, or abuse them, or overcomply with them, and just try combining data sets into a single new data set that you can do research on. There's lots of evidence from the genomics community that data usage agreements are a disaster because it basically prevents research that mines this data. You cannot combine the data sets legally. So you either ignore the contract or you can't do your research. Which means that there's been a shift towards using tools like Creative Commons. I'm sure you're all familiar with Creative Commons licenses. And so the new thing is to slap a CC BY copyright license on your data as part of a data sharing policy compliance. And this is increasingly being requested by entities like the Public Library of Science. So they have a new data sharing policy. They thought the path of least resistance was to use the same license that they apply to articles. So they're putting CC BY licenses on data. And that raises a whole host of other issues that we heard about from the Creative Commons people. Because, again, so there is this debate about whether data is even copyrightable. And CC BY licenses would only apply to copyrightable data. But the main thing is that BY licenses require attribution to the copyright owner. This is not the same thing as giving credit to the researcher. So what you're doing is creating these barriers for people who are trying to comply and not achieving the thing you really want, which is giving credit to the person who produced the research. So an example of that is what they call attribution stacking. So you have a data set that was produced by thousands of people over time, and now it has a CC BY license on it. So, well, who are the owners that you have to cite, and how do you do that if there are thousands of people? We don't have the technical mechanisms to do that. So it just leads to this, unsolvable problem. So what Creative Commons recommends is that you just waive rights. Use the CC0 waiver, forget about it, and we, as a community, need to establish better norms for how we're going to give people the credit they need and control the data, not through contracts and not through copyright licenses, but by doing the right thing and deciding what that is. So those they call community norms, and the goal would be to give meaningful attribution and scholarly credit for people's work rather than trying to use these legal tools to accomplish that. And what data curators tell us is that what the researchers really care about at this point is just clarity. Just tell me what to do, and you figure out what the right legal mechanisms are. I'm not a lawyer. I don't want to be one. Just tell me what to do, and I'll do it. So that was sort of the legal discussion. And the two big takeaways from that day were that we are talking about the wrong problem. It's not ownership. It's stewardship. Okay? And that it's normative, not legal. So a major conclusion was that, at least for academic research data, this doesn't apply to all the other things you've been talking about, guardianship or stewardship is the right thing to focus on, and what that means. So let's just say the university owns the data. So what? As long as I get to control who has access to it and what they can do with it, that's fine. And what I want is credit. So that's the thing to focus on. And to do that, adopting approaches like using a rights waiver to signal intent to share, and then being very clear about what you want in return, what kind of attribution or credit or citation you want, are the two things that would really achieve the goals of the community. So that led us to the conclusion that what we really should be talking about is data governance, which is not the same thing as data ownership. And I think Tom touched on this a little bit. So with that reframing, again and again, we heard that data sharing really works best when there is an established trust relationship between the producers and consumers. And that takes time to do. And we don't actually really understand how that trust develops. So we need to put a little bit more thought into what are the mechanisms to establish what are the ways that we can establish new trust mechanisms for data stewards, not owners, but stewards, so that they can develop that community norm in a way that we can all believe will work, and we won't have to revert to the legal mechanisms that we use when things fail, right? So we need to just get out of that mindset altogether. And that's where we left things for the day, and I would welcome any questions about it later. Thank you.